Right before we jump into this video, I have a lot of gear on this counter, but how do I keep it organized? No, I don't use a spreadsheet. I use my free app called My Gear Vault. It's the best way to input, organize, and protect your gear. Keep track of your serial numbers, keep track of your receipts. It is awesome to use. It's free. Download it right now at mygearvault.com for iOS and Android. Jared Polin, FroKnowsPhoto.com, and welcome to the Ultimate Battle version 2, the end of 2017 edition between Nikon and Canon. Now, before I jump into all of this, I want to tell you that I've done a real-world review of every single camera that's sitting here, so I have personal experience using it. You can download the raw files, the links are down below. But in this video, I want to put these head-to-head to help you decide which one might be the right one for you. Now, you may notice that I do not have a D610 on the counter because that one's 5 years old. I also don't have a Nikon DF because nobody really cares about that one. I don't have a 5DS or a 5DSR because I went with the latest versions that each camera company is offering as of right now in 2017. So let's jump into it. First up, we have the flagship cameras, the Nikon D5 and the Canon 1DX Mark II. Now, standing in for the 1DX Mark II is the 1DX Mark I. But for the purposes of this video, it's a 1DX Mark II. Now, these are the most expensive that you will find on both sides, Nikon and Canon. $6,500 for the Nikon, $6,000 for the Canon. They are very similar. I don't see one as being any better than the other. There are slight differences that are pros and cons on both sides. Now, this bad boy shoots 14 frames a second. This one does 12. This does 4K video. This does 4K video. They both crop that down. These cameras are built tough. They're built for action. They're built for sports. You can shoot anything with them, from weddings to portraits to babies. It doesn't matter. These cameras are going to be great no matter which one you go with. Now, there is a slight difference when it comes to higher ISO shooting. I've always been a big fan of how the Nikons look at the higher ISOs and think that the D5 is going to give you cleaner results than the 1DX Mark II. Now, the ISO of the D5 tops out natively at 102,400, whereas the 1DX tops out at 51,200. Now, having that extra stop difference comes into play when you're shooting at, say, 10,000 ISO, because 10,000 ISO I think is going to be cleaner on the D5 than it is going to be on the 1DX Mark II. Now, in the last Ultimate Battle, I talked about different lenses you can get with the Canons and the Nikons, especially for the flagship. Nikon at the time didn't have out the 105 1.4, which is one of my favorite portrait lenses on any body. I love the 105 1.4, but on this side, they have an 85 1.2, a 50 1.2. They have the faster glass, much faster than you can get with the Nikon. Nikon will not be able to make a 1.2 on the full frame body, which I talked about last time because of the mount that they've been using since the 50s. Canon, on the other hand, replaced that mount in the late 80s / the 90s, and it pissed people off, but since they've done it, they've been able to squeeze more glass, bigger glass into this body. In this day and age, having that 1.2 versus a 1.4, I don't think it's that big of a deal because we don't need to worry about those low light situations as much because you have such good high ISO capability. Also, on the Canon front, you now have an 11 to 24 millimeter lens, which I like more so than the Nikon 14 to 24, which hasn't been replaced in 8 years. So if you're deciding which one of these to go with, I could say flip a coin if you don't have either, but if you're heavily invested in Nikon, you're gonna go with the Nikon. If you're heavily invested in Canon, you're going with the Canon. And if you like to jump ship to Sony, we'll talk about Sony in a different video. This is just the ultimate battle between these two brands. Now, moving down the lines, we have the Nikon D850 and the Canon 5D Mark IV. The 5D Mark IV is about a year old, and the Nikon D850 just came out. They're priced very similarly. I think they're exactly the same. One is $32.99, where the other is $32.96.95. So you can see a couple of dollar difference there. But what I want to point out right now is, yes, the Nikon is brand new and just came out, and the Canon is a year old. But even when the Canon came out, it was already using older technology inside of the camera. So keep in mind that this camera won't be refreshed for at least another 3+ years, and this camera, the D850, already has some better features than what the 5D Mark IV has to offer. In terms of megapixels, the Nikon has 45.7, where the Canon has 30.4. Now, that is a lot of megapixels in both. But you might be wondering, how many frames a second can you get? Because the more megapixels you have, the larger the files. The Nikon D850 has a 100 megabyte uncompressed 14-bit RAW file. The Canons, they're in there around 40 megabytes, so they're much smaller. In frame rates, 7 frames a second for the Canon and 7 frames a second for the Nikon, but if you put the vertical grip on the Nikon with the Nikon D5 battery, you can squeeze out 9 frames a second, which makes this a better option than the 5D Mark IV for how many frames a second you can get. In terms of ISO, the Nikon goes from 64 to 25,600, with the Canon going from 100 to 32,000. Now, there's not a major difference in ISO there, but what I will say is if you are a landscape photographer, shooting at 64 is going to give you a tremendous dynamic range that you may be looking for. In terms of high ISO capability, I've been really happy with the files I was able to pull out of this camera at higher ISOs during the real-world review, and with the D850, I've been happy with those files as well. Now keep in mind, with more megapixels, you may not be able to get as clean high ISO shots, and I've pushed it to 6400 and a little further, and it's done a good job. But if you're looking for which camera is going to give you better high ISO capability, in this case, I'd probably lean towards the 5D Mark IV, but if you're taking everything into consideration, you may be looking at the D850. Again, I want to hammer home the older technology versus something that just came out that is built more for the future. A lot of the things in the D850 are built towards the future, whereas the 5D Mark IV was built with yesterday's technology, which means for the next 4 years, you're already behind. In terms of focusing points, the Canon has 61 of them, whereas the D850 has 153. So in this case, 153 is going to be better than what you can get in the 5D Mark IV. They both have great autofocusing systems, so whichever one you go with, you can't go wrong with it, but I would rather have 153. Now let's look at the memory card slots. The Nikon D850 has 2 card slots, an XQD and a UHS 2 SD card slot. The Canon, on the other hand, uses old technology compact flash and an old technology UHS 1 SD card slot. The Nikon is already future-proofed, whereas the Canon is not. I like having dual cards, but it makes no sense while you went with yesterday's technology, so again, leaning towards the D850. Both of these cameras offer you 4K video, which is a great thing, but with the Canon, it has a crop factor of 1.74, meaning any lens that you put on it, you need to multiply by 1.74 when you're shooting 4K video. It also has a bloated 4K file type, so with a 64 gigabyte card, you're getting something like 16 minutes of record time. And you have to use a compact flash card, not something like a CFast, which the 1DX Mark II has, which is a super fast card. On the Nikon front, you have full frame 4K video recording. That means any lens you put on it doesn't need to be multiplied, so your 14 to 24 is going to act as a 14 to 24. Canon's always been the camera that you looked for when it came to shooting video, but in this case, Nikon is starting to really push the future because you can shoot full frame 4K. Canon left that out. Now, where Canon does win is the dual pixel AF when it comes to autofocus for video. That is much better than anything that Nikon has to offer, but in this case, which camera would I be leaning towards if I needed to purchase my first DSLR or my first full frame and I wanted to look at these two? I find it very hard to say buy the Canon at this point. Yes, it's a year older than the Nikon, but in terms of the technology, it's 4 years older or 3 years older because they used a lot of old stuff. Can you still get great results with it? Absolutely. If I needed to shoot jobs with this, I would have no problem doing it. But if I wanted to jump into the game, I would be looking at the Nikon D850 as a major catch-all to shoot landscapes, to shoot architecture, to shoot sports, to shoot weddings, to shoot whatever you needed to do because it is action-packed with a ton of features. Now, moving down the line here, we have a 6D Mark II, we have a D750, and the reason that the D500 made it to this table is because it's basically priced the same as the 6D Mark II and has a lot of features, if not more features, than what the 6D Mark II has to offer. The 6D Mark II is the newest out of those cameras. The D750 is already 3 years old, and the D500 is a little over a year. In terms of pricing, the D500 D500 is $1,900, the D750 is still $1,800, and then this bad boy over here, the 6D Mark II, comes in at $2,000. The megapixels are all pretty similar, but what I want to point out is that the D500, of course, is a crop sensor camera. It does a great job. It's still not as good as a full frame camera, but I think it competes very well with the D750, and it's pretty good against the 6D Mark II. In terms of ISO, you get 100 to 40,000 ISO with the Canon. With the D750, you get 100 to 12,800 natively. See, 12,800 doesn't go as far, so the 6D Mark II is gonna give you cleaner shots at higher ISOs because the D750 doesn't go there. But it's 3 years old. It's probably gonna be replaced before this is replaced, and it's gonna replace it with a camera that's probably going to be better than this one. Now, in terms of the D500, this is interesting. It goes from 100 to 51,200. So Nikon believes in this camera's ISO so much that it actually goes further than a full-frame 6D Mark II. Now, in terms of frames per second, you're getting 10 frames a second with the D500, 6.5 frames a second with the D750, and 6.5 frames a second with the 6D Mark II. Now, if you're somebody who's jumping into the full-frame game for the first time and you just have enough money to squeeze into there, or you're trying to decide should you stick with the DX camera, these are the cameras that you're going to be looking at. If you already have some full-frame glass, you can jump into either of these systems and be happy with the results that you're getting. I always say it, no matter what you go with, it always comes down to you as the photographer. You need to know what you're doing in order to get great results with the camera. The cameras can help, but they're not going to get you great results if you don't know what you're doing. Autofocus is a big consideration. 45 autofocusing points in the Canon, the D750 gives you 51, and then the Nikon D500 gives you 153 that spread out really far across the frame because it's DX. Isn't that interesting that a 3-year-old camera has 51 autofocusing points, which is already better than what this new 6D Mark II has? The 6D Mark II, again, like the 5D Mark IV, came out and is brand new and has some new features, but it's missing so many things. It's also using yesterday's technology. You have to think about the future. It's pretty insane that the D750 is pretty comparable to the 6D Mark II at this point. And even when it comes down to video, this doesn't shoot 4K. The D500 even shoots 4K. The D750 doesn't shoot 4K, but it's similar at the 1080 that both of these cameras can do. But the one thing that the Canon always wins on, dual pixel AF when it comes to continuous autofocus for shooting video. We personally use the Nikon D750 to shoot a lot of the static videos here at the Fro factory. We will be replacing those soon with more Nikon D850s, but for now, if you need continuous autofocus, the 6D Mark II is great for that. I have also been using this as a vlogging camera because of that dual pixel AF and the fact that my lenses are full frame without any cropping needed. And another thing that makes this pretty good for vlogging is the fact that it has a tiltable, rotatable screen, so as I hold it out, I can see myself to make sure that the focus is spot on. But with the Nikons, you have tiltable screens, but they can't flippy McFlipperson. Now, I don't know if that one feature would be the end-all and be-all that would make me buy the Canon over the Nikon, but maybe this next feature would be. So how many card slots do you have in the camera? Both of these Nikons have 2 memory card slots. The D500 has an XQD and an SD. You have 2 SDs in the D750, and you have 1 SD in the Canon. So if you're into shooting dual redundancy, meaning both cards are saving the same pictures that you're taking, then obviously you would want to look into the Nikon way. But at the end of the day, which one of these cameras would I purchase if I was just getting started? This is more of a toss-up. I think this is a very nice starting point when it comes to getting a full-frame camera compared to a D750. The D750 is 3 years old. If you're already invested in Canon glass and the Canon ecosystem, the 6D Mark II is a very nice option despite it using older technology. If we had to make a decision between the 3 of these cameras, 6D Mark II is very good. D750, a little older than my taste would like. Still, you can get great results. I don't think you can go wrong. And with the money that you save with buying one of these used or refurbed, you can get some extra glass, which may come in handy. And I'm not sure that I would go with a crop sensor camera over a full frame camera if I had to make a decision. So out of all of these on the lineup, these are the harder ones. The entry-level ones into the full frame and the higher-end DX makes it a tougher decision on what to pick. At the end of the day, this is the current lineup that both of these systems offer. The interesting thing is, forget the flagship cameras. These are fantastic any way that you slice it. But with the two new cameras, the 6D Mark II and the 5D Mark IV, using older technology for so many things, they're not as future-proofed as the new ones that Nikon has out. I think the D850 eats the lunch of the 5D Mark IV any day of the week if you're just starting out. And even if you're looking to jump systems, I'm not a big fan of jumping systems unless you absolutely need to. If I needed to pick one of these to get started with and I could choose either one, of course I'm going with the D5. I own it, it's mine, I love it. But for the majority of the people out there, the D850 is probably the best choice out of all of these on the table. Yes, it's the newest, but it's the most future-proof. It has so many great functions and features no matter what you want to shoot. This camera is built for the future. It is tremendous. Now, don't forget that I've made a real-world review of all of these cameras that are on the counter right now. You can check those out. The links are down below. That way you can see for yourself how they work in the real world, as well as download the raw files to check them out for yourself. Now, my question to you is, if you could choose any of these cameras sitting here right now, which one would it be and why? Please leave a comment down below. And if you've been enjoying the free content that I've been putting out for the last 7+ years, would you please consider supporting the channel? There's a couple of ways that you can do that, and one of the major ways is checking out any of the 4 video educational guides that I have. The Fronos Photo Guide to Getting Out of Auto, the Flash Guide, the Guide to Shooting Video, and the Fronos Photo Guide to Video Editing. You can check out free previews of each of those at fronosphoto.com/guides. Now, picking those up, not only will you learn quite a bit, but you'll be supporting the free, fun, and informative content that I continue to put out into the world. As always, I look for your opinion, so please leave a comment down below with anything you'd like to say. Don't forget to like, share, and comment. And if you're on YouTube, hit subscribe. On Facebook, give it a Sherry McSherrison, and that is where I'll leave it. Jared Pullen, FroKnowsPhoto.com. See ya.